the AfriKili family and Global Pack Nation. Welcome to the Global Pack Show. In today's show, we will talk about two topics. First, Pope Leo XIV, the man who was born as Robert Francis Prevost, who was born in Chicago and grew up in that city, turns out to have black origins. His grandparents, originally from Louisiana, but of Haitian and potentially Dominican ancestry, but nevertheless classified as or categorized as black in censuses going back to the 1900s. So the phrase was Habemus Papam when the Pope was finally elected. Should it have been Habemus Black Papam? We shall see. And secondly, the charismatic Captain Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso, gave a stirring and very powerful interview with Russian outlet RT. During that interview, he accused the West and France in general of painting him as a Russian puppet, when in fact he is simply fighting so that the oppressed can have a voice, and he's fighting for unity so that there's a new world that allows not only his country to rise up, but black people in general. So we'll discuss that and more in today's show. Let's fasten our seatbelts, let's dive in, and let's get to work. All right, family, it's such a pleasure for me to be with you once again here today. This is Tony Pumusimba Kwamba Mangumbu. Thank you very much for your support before starting on this May 13, 2025. First of all, guys, thank you so much. I just can't believe what's happening with the video that we did 3 days ago, talking about the charismatic Jasmine Crockett, but also Captain Ibrahim Traore, is racking up views, and it's unbelievable. So thank you very much for your support. I'm seeing comments, I'm seeing likes. Your support means a lot. And for those of you who have not done so, let me ask you to please take the time to click the subscribe button. It only takes a second. By doing that, you're helping me tremendously. You're helping this platform grow. You're allowing us to reach the goals we've set for ourselves in 2025. But also, it allows you to become part of the dialogue as this community is growing. So please consider clicking on the subscribe button. It only takes a second. But thank you so much. All right, today we have two interesting topics. We'll talk about the Pope, who has black origins. We'll talk about Captain Ibrahim Traore. Before doing that, just a quick note. I don't know if you followed the news, but yesterday was a fairly significant day because the first Afrikaners refugees. Afrikaners are white South Africans. If you recall, a few weeks ago I did a show, and we were very critical of how Donald Trump and his advisor Elon Musk are painting the situation of white South African Afrikaners who are descendant of Dutch, French, Germans in South Africa. They're the minority, somewhere around 13% of the population, but until this day still own the large majority of the agricultural land, for example, over 75%. The Afrikaners, who were the ones that installed the apartheid regime in South Africa. That was a brutal regime. It was a system of segregation that oppressed and killed a lot of black people in South Africa, the large majority. That system that was abolished in 1994 with Nelson Mandela, the one and only Madiba Mandela, eventually becoming president. Well, we talked about how it was really misinformation, how Donald Trump likes talking about fake news, but saying that white Afrikaners were facing potential genocide was absolutely fake news. To the point where, for example, in South Africa, you have a city called Orania. Some of you might not be familiar with it. If you have time, you can just go on the internet, type in South Africa, type Orania, as in orange, but Orania, and you will see it's a white-only city in South Africa till this day. It's a city that was created about 30 years ago, that has grown since, by people who wanted to continue the apartheid system, the racist system in South Africa, and it's a city where black people are not allowed to live till this day in South Africa. So going from a situation like that, and saying that the white South Africans that are still holding the economy in that country, still the privileged class, is oppressed, is so disingenuous. But anyways, yesterday, the first batch, it was about 59 of Afrikaners were received in the United States. Now, Donald Trump, when he came into office, he suspended the refugee program. Refugee means a refugee is somebody who flees his country, right, because of persecution, conflict, or something along those lines, crosses border and becomes a refugee. When you flee within your own border, you're what's called an internally displaced person. A refugee is somebody who crosses the border. So Trump suspended the refugee resettlement program. So in other words, taking in refugees into the United States, because he said our southern border was being invaded. We have an invasion from people from all different places. He talks about people being released from prison, asylums, or whatever. So he suspended the refugee program. In this case, he decided to reopen it only for white South Africans. Only white South Africans, under the false pretense that they are really facing persecution in their country and facing a potential genocide. Now, we like giving people the benefit of the doubt, right? It's we don't want to classify people as racist or non-racist unless they really, clearly say it in through their mouths. But here's the deal: how can you fault people from seeing a clear racist double standard in this case? Because you have to understand, when it comes to refugee, for example, when Donald Trump suspended the refugee program, you had hundreds of people that were already admitted, already vetted as refugees to come into the US, that were simply awaiting a plane to come. You're talking about people like Afghan refugees. Afghans were refugees because of the war that was started by the United States in Afghanistan, right? And so they enlisted many Afghans to help them in that war in Afghanistan. When the US decides to leave Afghanistan, the people who helped them are now fearing for their lives, and some of them being killed by the Taliban who took power in Afghanistan. So those people go through a vetting process to be a refugee. They are accepted. Donald Trump comes, interrupts the program, so they're in limbo. So you had people like that, for example, who are facing a more urgent danger compared to the white South Africans. But he comes, not only does he open the process, he accelerates the vetting process. That can take years, guys. Let me give you an example. You'll hear sometimes of Rohingya refugees and Burmese refugees. You have people in the Great Lake region around Congo and so on. You have people that have been in refugee camps for 20 plus years, even more, because they are waiting to be vetted so that they can be resettled. Resettled means being sent into another country. So you have people that had to flee their home country, are living in refugee camps in their host countries, waiting in line, right? Have been vetted. Yet, Donald Trump does not want to bring them in. On the flip side, gets people who are not in imminent danger for their lives, but can only be white, because that's one of the conditions. You have to be a white South African, an Afrikaner, persecuted because you're white. And he said in some minorities, but it's only white South Africans. You open up the program only for white. You can understand, right, how people can accuse this administration of really engaging into a racist policy. That is clearly racist. And as a matter of fact, I'm glad to see that the Episcopal Church that had worked for the longest with the federal government in terms of resettling refugees, because you have to understand, when refugees come into the United States, normally the federal government has a program to allow them to get housing, help them, find jobs and so on. And just to be exact, this is not only the United States, because the refugee program is part of the Geneva Conventions. It's essentially conventions that happen with all the countries in the world that had to sign the Geneva Convention that says that if somebody comes to your border and somebody is persecuted or is fearing for their lives, you have to let them into your borders, listen to their case and their story, and then you determine if they qualify as a refugee or not. All countries that signed the Geneva Convention have to do that. And so once you listen to the person's story, if you establish that their story does not qualify them as a refugee in your country, then you initiate removal proceedings for them to be deported from your country. If you establish that the story is valid, right, that their lives really they're fearing for their lives, there's credible threats against their lives because of who they are and so on, then you accept them as refugees, and then you have to help them resettle. So most countries in the world, you talk about Europe and so on, so they take in refugees. Germany has taken in many refugees from Syria and other places. The UK takes in refugees. France, Sweden. So it's not only the US that does that. But in this case, Trump, again, had suspended the program for all these brown and black refugees, saying that the country's invaded, but he opens it up for only white South Africans, descendant of Dutch, German, French colonizers in South Africa. In a country where the white South Africans are still dominating the economy, are still the privileged class in South Africa, still own most of the land, agricultural land in South Africa. Do you see that paradox? Again, how can you not understand if people start talking about the double standard here? It is just appalling. Unfortunately, it is appalling that this administration would do something along those lines. I just wanted to mention that before we get into our topics today, and we'll continue following that. But it's really, really, again, very, very unfortunate. So sorry, not sure what's going on with my voice here. All right, so let's jump straight into our first story. Robert Francis Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope in the history of the Catholic Church. Habemus Papam was stated last Thursday, the 8th. As you recall the process, cardinals went into a conclave in the Sistine Chapel, and they voted. And so you had smoke coming out of the chimney. Black smoke meant they couldn't come to an agreement, at least a 2/3 plus one vote. But eventually, on Thursday, we saw white smoke coming out of the chimney in the Vatican, at the Sistine Chapel. And a cardinal comes on the balcony and says, Habemus Papam. Habemus Papam, which means we have a pope. And so here comes Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, who decides to choose the name of Leo XIV. That is now well established. I think most people in the world understand that story. In case of the United States, you would have thought that it should have been great joy for a lot of people. But unfortunately, in the MAGA circle, the Donald Trump circle, he is not a very popular pope, because before becoming pope, he has been very critical of the Trump administration. On several occasions, he has attacked the Trump administration. As a matter of fact, he's even had some tweets. Some people are wondering, why didn't his team go into his Twitter X feed and delete some of the old tweets that he had? But no. So if you go on his Twitter profile, as you can see here, he still has old tweets that are still up there where he was really attacking J.D. Vance. Like, for example, on this tweet, he was clearly saying that J.D. Vance is wrong. Jesus does not ask us to rank our love for others. So that's the kind of pope that, kind of cardinal he was. So you can understand why in the MAGA circle, people started accusing him of being a woke pope, being liberal, blah, 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 blah. So he's not very popular in the MAGA circle. As a matter of fact, I remember when he came out and, when he gave his first speech, he spoke in Latin, he spoke in Spanish, Italian. He didn't speak in English. So some people, some conservative, were very upset about that. How can an American Pope come and not even speak in English? I mean, forgetting the fact that the Catholic Church is a universal church, right? It's not just an American church. And the Pope spent over 2/3 of his life outside of the United States. He spent over 20 years in Peru in Latin America. So he speaks Spanish fluently. He spent many years in Europe. He's been in Africa. So he spent over 2/3 of his life in outside of America, the United States of America. So he is really a world citizen by all accounts. So not popular, but the one thing that came out and that really surprised a lot of people, well, it appears that the Pope has Black ancestry. So the picture that you see here, and we'll talk about that in detail. So there's his grandma here and his grandfather, who were categorized in the census in the early 1900s as Black and mulatto, which mulatto was essentially a person of mixed race. And people started digging into his ancestry, and turns out, yes, he was born in Chicago, but his family emigrated from the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana to Chicago in 1910. And it is only after emigrating to Chicago that on their census they changed their ethnic classification from Black to white. Yeah, you hear that right. I'm not making this up. And we'll go through some information here. I was very surprised to see that. I mean, looking at him, I would not have guessed that, the person, that the Pope was necessarily of Black ancestry. But yeah, his parents are Black. So we'll go through some information on the article here. So the article that is interesting, there are many articles about it, but we'll read a few lines from this article from the AP, the Associated Press. So the article title is Pope Leo XIV, Creole Heritage, Highlights a Complex History of Racism and the Church in America. It is a fascinating article. There are many more articles. You can go on The Guardian, you'll see some articles. But this one is interesting, in my opinion, because it has a lot of good biographical information. So let's go through this article together, okay? And let's see here if we're able to. So I will be reading. I think you should be able to see me scroll through this article on my computer screen. Excellent. All right. So this is the article in question. You see the picture of Robert Prevost, Pope Leo. Now people started saying, well, if you look at his skin and you're from Louisiana, you're not surprised because his skin looks a bit olive. That's how people in Louisiana like to call themselves. They say he looks Creole. Creole is a term from the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana, which encompasses a rich ethnic background. So when you talk about Creole people in Louisiana, it's people with French heritage, with Black, so African heritage, the Caribbean. And so the Creole population has, throughout history, really, at least from the Gulf Coast, have had strong ties with the Caribbean and so on. And so even there's a version of French. For example, there's an expression, if you're from Louisiana, you're very familiar with this. It says, laissez le bon temps rouler. Laissez le bon temps. In English, it'll say, laissez le bon temps rouler. Laissez, which means, laissez le bon temps rouler in French. It means just have a good time, all right? So just let the good time go by. So it's all about having a good time and so on. So that's a very typical expression in Louisiana, but you can, obviously it's a French expression. So yeah, so Robert Prevost is from that region. All right, so let's go through some of the interesting part of the article. I had to refresh it here because my software is tripping. I'm not sure what's happening here. Okay, so the new Pope's French-sounding last name Prevost intrigued Jerry Honora, a New Orleans genealogist who began digging in the archives and discovered the Pope had deep roots in the Big Easy. So thank you to Miss Jerry Honora, because really all the information that we uncovered, and so now there's a whole bunch of people researching all kind of stuff about the Pope, Well, it comes because this genealogist, Jani Nora, she's the one who did the research and found out about the Pope's black origin. So all four of Pope Leo XIV's maternal grandparents were free people of color in Louisiana based on the 19th century census record. So this is an important situation in the free people of color. So typically that meant that people had a certain like enslavement in their ancestry. And so as, slavery was abolished and so on. So you had this term, applied to people, so free people of color. So that's what it entailed. Although there's nothing so far in the genealogy at this point that has come to showcase that we haven't uncovered at least any direct link to somebody being enslaved in the Pope's life. And just a quick comment: the Pope himself, at least his brother John, was asked if he knew anything about this ancestry. He said that in their family they really never talked about race. It's just something that didn't come out. All right, so let's continue here. So now this is interesting. As you can see in the record here, the Pope's mother, Miss Mildred Agnes Martinez, obviously was the daughter of Joseph Martinez, as you can see in the second level, the grandparents level here. All right, so you have the mother, that's the first orange circle of brown. Then you have the grandparents, and then the next level, the third generation, is the great-grandparents. So at his grandparents level, so Joseph Martinez, who was the Pope's mother's father, is of Haitian descent from Haiti. Isn't that fascinating? And the Pope's grandma, Louise Bakieks, is mulatto and black. That's how she was on the census. Now, interestingly enough, the Pope's father, the Pope's grandfather, Joseph Martinez, here it says that he's from Haitian descent. We'll see later that there's a bit of confusion because on his marriage license, he actually said that he was from Santo Domingo, which was the capital city of the Dominican Republic. However, here it's established on some birth documents, birth certificates, that he was from Haiti. Fascinating. And then the next level, the third level, third generation, so his great-grandparents, these are all on the maternal side, all right, on his mother's side. Because on his dad's side, they're more of a Italian ancestry, all right? The Pope's dad's side are of Italian ancestry, but this is all on the maternal side. So the great-grandparents, you can see that Jacques Martinez and Mary Rose Ramos were people of color. And then Ferdinand Basquiz and Eugénie Grandbois, mulatto. Those are all French names. Like Ferdinand Bakieks, that's a French name. Eugénie Grandbois, big woods, that's a French name. So the confusion that I was mentioning, so if you look at the marriage certificate, right? So here is, I'm going to put it, enlarge it so my face will be a bit hidden here, but so be it. Now you can see on the marriage certificate that Haiti, so this is the Pope's grandfather, all right? So his mother's dad. You can see that the place of birth, he has it set as Haiti, or Haiti, spelled Hayti, Haiti, which is why there's some debates here. I mean, on his marriage license, he's saying that he's from Haiti. Nevertheless, when you look at the some of his birth certificate documents, he says that he was born in Santo Domingo, which is the capital city of the Dominican Republic. So that's where a bit of the confusion happens. All right, let's go back to the article because there's some very interesting part of that article, in my opinion, that we all need to see here. So, all right. Okay, so we have seen the family tree again. Fascinating. We have a pope with black ancestry. I'm not making this up. This is not a case where people say, yeah, black people always wanted to go about race. No, this is an interesting fact. It came up. It's in the data. So the people out there who wanted a black pope, people were saying we want the first black pope. I mean, technically, the pope is not black per se, but he has some black ancestry on his mother's side, black. So that is really interesting here. Okay, so let's continue going down the article. I managed to change the software. I don't know why the software is just like really malfunctioning today. Okay, so the lady is talking about she's excited, and Andrew, a professor. Let's go continue down, and so this is interesting. This portion here. Okay, so the former Cardinal Robert Prevost's maternal grandparents identified as mulatto and black in historical records. They were married in New Orleans in 1887 and lived in the city's historically Creole 7th Ward, folks. So they're from the 7th Ward. In the coming years, the Jim Crow regime of racial segregation rolled back past Civil War reforms, and just about every aspect of their lives was circumscribed by race, extending even to the church. I mean, this to me, it's just a lot of fascinating facts here. So yeah, so the Pope, the 7th Ward. Now, their neighborhood, as we will see, was eventually destroyed because they had to build an overpass. So a lot of, African-American businesses, black businesses were destroyed. But yeah, all right. So this is now the key part. I will explain why his grandparents changed their ethnicity from black to white. This is really the part here. All right. So the Pope's grandparents migrated to Chicago around 1910. Like many other African American families living the racial oppression of the Deep South, and passed for white, Honora said. Again, let me read that. I didn't read that properly. So the Pope's grandparents migrated to Chicago around 1910. Like many other African American families living the racial oppression of the Deep South, and passed for white, Honora said. Honora is the scientist, the genealogist who uncovered all this information. So the Pope's mother, Mildred Agnes Martinez, who was born in Chicago, is identified as white in her 1912 birth certificate. All right. So the mom is identified as white, and she explains why. She says, you can understand people may have intentionally sought to obfuscate their heritage. Always, life has been precarious for people of color in the South, New Orleans included. So the Pope's grandparents' old home in New Orleans was later destroyed, along with hundreds of others, to build a highway overpass that eviscerated a stretch of a largely black neighborhood in the 1960s. All right, and finally, there's before I add on some of the comments here. Oops. Finally, it's okay. Then it goes more into the hope and so on. All right, I think I'm going to end up here again. If you're interested in this article, here is the title. We can go on the internet, go on AP. That's the title. Pope Leo the 14th's Creole heritage highlights a complex history of racism and the church in America. All right. So what are we to make of all this? The Pope is black. Habemus, black Papam. Look, ultimately it doesn't really matter if the Pope is black or not in the grand scheme of things. It would have made a lot of black people proud. I get that, because he would have been a first. Nevertheless, this is still an interesting fact here. The Pope has black ancestry. going, starting in New Orleans in the deep South, in the deep racial part of America. And then you have the Jim Crow laws. You essentially have rollbacks of many freedom that was earned by black people. So a lot of people had to flee the South. And so just like many black families, the Pope's grandparents, maternal grandparents, had to flee the South, New Orleans, and emigrate to Chicago. And after doing that, on the next census, they changed their racial ethnicity from black to white. And as we've seen in the article, it's a practice that was done quite often by people fleeing the South. That's still understood there was still some tension, some racial tension, so they just didn't want to attract attention to themselves. And obviously the reason why they can pass as white, the implication here is that, the skin was fairly clear, fair and being mulatto and things of that nature, whereas in the South, they were classified as black. So that's the history of the Pope. This brings the attention to another point, right? Because, and I'm going to deviate a bit here and talk a bit about the whole race situation. This is one of the many reasons why, in my opinion, and as I've said many times on this platform, racism is one of the most stupid things, in my opinion. Racism on the basis of skin color is idiotic. Like, really. But first of all, I'm sure if we did some DNA test, some of the white people who just think that they're superior than, that black people are beneath them and so on, because you have some white supremacists. It will be hilarious if some of the people do DNA tests and uncover that there's black, there's some black ethnicity. As was with the Pope here, if nobody told you, people probably would not have necessarily accepted or agreed. And the same applies to, you have a lot of black people, as we know in the history, unfortunately, the violence that was perpetrated against black women, during slavery and so on, even later on. We had, unfortunately, a lot of abuse. So a lot of black people have white blood also in them. And rest assured, that's not just in the United States of America. Clearly, the Caribbean is the same. You go into Africa, some Africans that might see them, look totally black, might also have some drop of white blood somewhere in their ancestry. This is all to say that, look, humans, we are humans, right? So this platform, at no point will this ever be about racism. Will this ever be about just putting one skin color above the others? This is about reforming a world that unfortunately gravitated to that ideology of racism for way too long. A world that had created system for way too long to prevent people of a dark complexion from reaching certain heights, right? And for not partaking into like wealth creation opportunities. There's a conditioning that has happened. So it's about reforming that. That's why this platform exists, but it's certainly not about racism. Look, I like a good laugh. If you, as you get to know me as we go forward, I like joking, right? It's good to have humor and have fun and laugh and so on. So as I was reading about Robert Prevost, the Pope, a thought immediately came to my mind. You know what? Dave Chappelle. You're probably wondering, what? What in the world, Dave Chappelle? Yes, sir. There was a skit that Dave Chappelle did many, many years ago. Clayton Bigsby, the only black Klansman. That skit is hilarious. Every time I watch it, I literally come to tears. That is how funny that skit is. Clayton Bigsby. I highly recommend that you go on YouTube. If you want to laugh about this whole racial nonsense, look at that skit, man. Clayton Bigsby. And it is Clayton Bigsby. So Dave Chappelle plays the role of a Ku Klux Klan, a Klansman, but he's black. He doesn't realize that he's black because he's blind. So he was born blind. in a very white part of America, deep America, country, rural America. And so in the orphanage where it was also brought up, the orphan directors and so on decided never to let him know that he's black. So he grew up not knowing that he was black, but being a staunch racist. And so imagine the irony. So Dave Chappelle joins the Klans, the Ku Klux Klan, and he becomes the leader. Robert Clayton Bigsby, he writes books about black people. And so there's a journalist who decides to go find out who is this Clayton Bigsby. And that's Robert Bogart, who passed away also William Bogart, passed away also, I think in 2003, may his soul rest in peace. So the journalist goes, interviews Clayton Bigsby, but first as he arrives on the porch, he's asking, I'm here to see Clayton Bigsby, because you see this black person who is seated next to this white lady. They're both blind. And Dave Chappelle, the black guy, said, "It's me." And the journalist said, "What? The writer?" Is like, "Yes, I am." And so the journalist in his mind is like, how did we get to this point where we have a black person who is a Klansman, who's talking so badly about black people, like really racist? What is going on here? So he ends up interviewing him, but throughout the skit, eventually they get to a meeting. There was supposed to be a book signing, and people are cheering up because, Clayton Bigsby, the Klansman, come, and he has his hat, what the KKK was wearing. But then somebody say, "Yeah, take your hat off. Let's see your face, Brother Bigsby." It's obviously a bunch of racists in the assembly. He say, "Yeah, sure, I know." So and Dave Chappelle takes off the hat, and you could see the expressions in the hall. Everybody holding their breath. Somebody was so overwhelmed that even his head ends up exploding. It is just so funny. hilarious. They couldn't believe what is going on. And so eventually Clayton Bigsby realizes that he is black. He accepts it, but then he divorces his wife of 19 years. Why did he divorce her? Because she was blind like him. He said, because she likes black people. She's a black person lover. So the conditioning somewhere stayed. So this skit, Dave Chappelle hit on so many cultural issues in this society. How absurd racism is. How at the end of the day, it's this skin color that we put on our face, that we set as such a limiting factor, is such a detail. There's nothing inherently wrong or advantageous that comes just with the skin color. Now, the systems that we've created have created conditions where it is advantageous to have a certain skin color versus others. We see it, it's not by accident that things like poverty and so on are overwhelmingly impacting black people versus others. But those are based on systems that were put in place, okay? And Dave Chappelle hits up on that. So the moral of the story here, folks, is like racism is ridiculous. There's really no point. It's idiotic. Racism on the basis of skin color, like, quite frankly. Okay, so that was that. Now let's move on to, Pope Leo, the first black pope, as some people would say, or at least a pope with black ancestry. All right, so our final story today is Ibrahim Traore, the charismatic president of Burkina Faso, who is called the President of Africa by many people, the person who is galvanizing the global P.A.C, the global Pan-African community, which is the big Pan-African diaspora around the world, African-American communities, Caribbean, Latin America. So his popularity is just continuing to skyrocket. So he gave an interview on a Russian channel called RT, and this is because he was visiting Russia as part of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Called many head of state in Russia to commemorate the victory of Russia against Nazism, because in the Second World War, Russia actually ended up losing more soldiers than anybody else. Over 1 million soldiers, Russian soldiers, fought to liberate Europe. And so this was a celebration to commemorate that. And so Vladimir Putin invited all these heads of state. And so Ibrahim Traore was one of the head of state that was invited in Russia. So he goes, and so he gives this interview that has now been making the waves around the internet. On this interview, he is accusing and attacking France. A lot of deep things that he's saying. And out of this interview, we can see that he's talking about how France is painting him as being a Russian puppet. So that interview, which you can find on the internet, there are a few interesting lines, right, that I've taken out of it. So I'm just going to share some of the thoughts that came through that interview. We will not, play the whole thing. It's about 30 minutes. So if you go online and just search RT, which is Russia Today, or Ibrahim Traore's interview, you will see it's an interview in French. Although I've seen some people are using AI to post that same video, but translate it in French, in English. I guess AI nowadays allows us to do it. Which, by the way, I'm wondering if that's what I should be doing on this channel, because as you've noticed, I post the same topics. I alternate between French and English. Like, for example, the topic I'm addressing today, or our next show tomorrow, I will cover the same topics, but in French, to allow different audiences to follow. But maybe I should use AI as well, right? So that the show is interpreted for me. Nevertheless, all right, so out of the interview, there's some big points, right, that came out of that Ibrahim Traore was wanting to convey, some powerful messages. So there's messages about education, messages about needed reforms in industry and the economy, mentions about how foreign powers are actually advancing unrest in Burkina Faso. There's a message about refusing aid from the outside. And then there's a message about unity. So let's go through these messages one by one. So in terms of the education reform, which I found that it was very interesting, because he's talking about setting up partnerships with Russia in terms of like science partnerships, having like education exchanges. Like right now, apparently there are already many Burkina Faso students in Russia, but he's calling to increase that, but also having partnership, because his ultimate goal is to have a proliferation of universities in Burkina Faso and in the region. So to me, that was excellent. That was fascinating. Because let's face it, brothers and sisters, I mean, one of the major issues we have in our communities, some of the issues we have can be solved with better education. Because there's a lot of information we lack in our communities. We just have to be honest about that. When I look at the state of education, generally speaking, across the African continent, for example, education is, we've allowed education to be degraded over the decades. And so if we want long-lasting reforms that will really allow a proliferation of competent, intellectual class, we need to reform education. If you look at our communities, the global P.A.C communities in the United States of America, with our African American communities, generally speaking, like education in underserved and in Black areas are usually underfunded compared to other more rich areas in white areas and so on. That is a fact. So we also need an education reform there. So across the global P.A.C, whether it's within the larger Pan-African diaspora outside of the African continent or within the African continent, education has to be a focus of all reforms going forward. Now, education is an investment that will not return benefits immediately, because when you talk about educating young people, it's a 15 to 20-year process, right? So it's an investment, it's a long-term investment to really see a transformation of minds, but it is nevertheless needed. If ultimately we want Africa to be the powerhouse that it can be, if we want our global P.A.C communities in the United States to become stronger financially speaking and so on, we need reform in education. In the case of the United States, for example, we need education beyond just traditional education. Things like financial education, financial literacy, things like that need to be improved. In the Caribbean, we need education reform. So seeing Traore really hammer that point was very encouraging to me, and just kind of reinforces this notion that this guy, he gets it. Ibrahim Traore really, really gets it. He's an intelligent man, an intelligent young man, given that he's only 37 years old. So very interesting that he would mention that. And so he acknowledges that reforms are difficult. Now, you talked about the industry, for example, how he wants to diversify from gold. Remember when Michael Langley made his comments in the Senate Arms Committee accusing Traore of utilizing gold for himself as opposed to the well-being of his people? Well, Traore talks about the gold here, understanding that gold is the number one resource export of Burkina Faso today, but he's talking about diversifying the economy. So he's putting reforms that he understands will take a long time. And he says in that interview that it is hard because he's finding systems that are so ingrained, have deep roots. And so that goes back to what I was saying 2 days ago. Remember when I said that, look, we've seen many leaders that come in with the greatest of intention, but in situations where they don't have strong institutions to accompany their effort, they end up being disappointed or just kind of falling on the wayside and start utilizing the resources for their own benefits because they're not able to advance their mission. We've seen that a lot. And so seeing that he mentions that, right? Traore is saying that it is hard. Like the reforms that he's putting in place are hard because he's finding systems that are so ingrained. That's a reality. So he really, really needs the support. Like Traore's success will be dependent on having a strong team of reformers around him, but that ultimately succumbs on him, right? Understanding how to have the right people around him, and then the delegation process starts, and then until all the reforms get all the way to the ground. But he needs that around him. Otherwise, implementing those reforms will be difficult. Because when you talk about changing systems and changing minds, oh man, there's nothing harder than changing people's minds. It is very, very, very difficult. But he talked about one of his key reforms in the diversification is that the industry, he wants to focus on adding value as opposed to just exporting raw material. And that should be the focus across the African continent, really, of all nations, is to move away from always exporting raw material. Stop exporting your raw cocoa, when people end up making chocolate and so on overseas. So like Ghana is deciding now to transform cocoa locally. That's what should be done. All these countries like Burkina Faso, stop exporting your raw gold and so on. Senegal, when it comes to cotton and so on. So the more people in the countries in the global P.A.C, in Africa, but also the big Pan-African diaspora, the Caribbean and so on, Latin America, focus on value add. Value add means transforming products. For example, if you have raw cocoa, just like, cocoa beans, and you decide, for example, to dry grind them, that's already transformation. You decide to make powder out of that. That is value add. You're adding value because every transformation step adds value of that product, becomes more expensive. So the more you can transform the product, it means the more expensive you will sell it. So the more money you get it, as opposed to look at the example of chocolate, for example. How absurd was it that Africa, that's the biggest producer of cocoa in countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast, initially would only export the cocoa beans at the most raw form. The beans would go overseas, get transformed into chocolate and cocoa and all that, and then it comes back, and the country that initially produced it buys it 10, 20 times more. Ludicrous. So it is good to see that you have countries that are increasingly stepping away from that model. Because the other thing is when you transform, you create jobs, right? Because every transformation step has to be done by people. Even though machines nowadays are bringing increasing productivity, industry might not be as labor intensive as it used to be. You might need less hands. Nevertheless, you're creating jobs. So the more you transform, the better it is. And so if we want the global P.A.C to become a strong economic power, industry is needed. Value add is needed. So it's good to see that Captain Traore talked about that in his interview. When it comes to security, that's a part where he did not hold his punch. He was very direct. Talking about how since 2023, they have made a lot of headways to fight the terrorists that had taken big swath of the country, but he's been able to recoup big portion of the country. However, he was very clear about how foreign powers were supporting the terrorists by sending drones, by sending experts to train those terrorists. He knows it because some of the weapons they're capturing on the ground, it comes from overseas. And he said that the reason why these foreign powers were supporting these terrorists is because they wanted to continue advancing the unrest, because with that instability, it creates a condition for those foreign powers to continue exploiting the resources. Because if you have a strong administrative power that controls the entire territory, it becomes impossible to illegally exploit a lot of the natural resources. And so, yeah, in his word, he said that was the imperialists doing it. And on that point, he kept talking about unity, how it's important for people to unite, to have a common front, to be able to ward off attack from the outside. So he talked about aid, how he, Russia, for example, gave Burkina Faso aid of wheat, wheat to make bread and stuff like that when there's conflict in Russia, Ukraine started. The wheat supply chain was disrupted across the world. Russia gave big, donation, but he said they had said thank you, but they refused any future aid. They told the Russian leadership that they did not want to receive any aids going forward in terms of wheat. And so that's the kind of message that the young people gravitate to. See, Africa does not need aid. Black people don't need handouts. Black communities, the global P.A.C, the global Pan-African communities. Communities have what it takes to succeed. It's about setting up the right condition. Minds are there, the brilliant minds. Manpower is there. No need for aid. As opposed to the old model of leaders that would constantly be seen as begging for aid, within the United Nations system, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on, just begging for assistance. He's the kind of leader who's stepping away from that model. And that's one of the reasons why he's so popular. Because he's talking to the pride that Black people around the world have. See, we'll stand up against oppression. We will decide how we do business. And we don't need any handouts. And he's standing up for that. And he talked about how the influence of France has been diminishing in the West African region in general. Because obviously many of the countries were colonized by France, which is why French is the language spoken in many of those countries. For the longest, there was this concept called France-Afrique. France-Afrique essentially meant that, many parts of Africa belonged to France. France was directing the politics of several African countries. And so, but now all that influence is going out of the window because you have countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. They literally kicked out all the French troops. You have many other countries in the region stepping away from France. And so, but Traore said that is the fault of the French people themselves, who are the cause behind that, because of their paternalistic position. So he accused France of really holding paternalistic position. And so this is where the whole Russian trope came by. The title of this show, for example, was "Is Ibrahim Traore a Russian puppet?" Because France is accusing him of being a Russian puppet. And Traore said that's one of the many reasons why France is losing all credibility in the region. Because whenever somebody speaks against the West foreign policy influence in that region, then France and the others start accusing them of being puppets of China and Russia. So Traore is like, as if Africans and Black people by themselves are not capable of thinking for themselves and deciding for themselves. And I'll tell you, the sentiment is that the youth understand they don't want to change one master for another, so to speak. So it's not about stepping away from your traditional Western powers, Europe and the United States, and just to go in the arms of Russia, China. No, it's about identifying where the real needs are and setting up win-win partnership that will truly advance the African interest and their partners' interest. And the same goes for all Black communities around the world. So that was a scathing accusation that he launched against France of being paternalistic. Finally, the way he concluded the interview to me was really the most powerful. And that was so refreshing to hear, because he finished the interview by saying, you know, the awakening happened in his own mind when he understood how he had been conditioned for many years via Western media outlets. Because if you go in many African countries, right, especially French-speaking African countries, you have French media channels. Like there's one called TV5, TV5. There's another one called France 24, French 24. Essentially, RFI, Radio France Internationale. Those radio and TV channels were the de facto channels across many French-speaking countries in Africa. So Traore talked about even in his youth how when some countries would ban those radios, they would do everything possible to even record those shows and find a way to play them. But all those medias that are funded actually by the French government are set up for a very specific agenda. By the way, the United States does the same thing. When you hear VOA, Voice of America, for many years, Voice of America was a tool of American propaganda, right, around the world to advance certain soft power. But Traore said that the awakening in his mind happened when he finally understood the conditioning that was being perpetrated by a lot of these medias. And so, because of that, he's very intent today on utilizing same communication strategies, even encouraging debates through the media that go in line with a Pan-Africanist awakening, because he's very big on unity. He mentioned unity many, many times in his interview. He is hell-bent on doing his part of ensuring unity, not only in his country, but a Pan-African unity, because he understands that by doing so, the minds will be reformed, and then Black people will be able to create a solid block to demand true change. So I'm very encouraged to really hear his point of view. And again, it just goes to confirm that this guy is not all fluff. He is substance. Captain Ibrahim Traore is full of substance, right? He is an intelligent guy. He has his head on his shoulders. He seems to really have a good vision. And we can only hope that he will succeed in his quest for unity, and he will stand fast as he's trying to implement the reforms, as he's facing tremendous headwinds. Because being a reformer is never an easy thing, right? Back in the days, in my business school days, I remember I used to have a teacher that used to say that pioneers are usually the ones that come back with arrows in their chest, right? So in other words, when you're a trailblazer, there's a lot of dangers that you'll face, and you might end up being the first one to feel the full brunt of that attack. You're doing it for the benefit of everybody who comes after you, though. Now, obviously, I don't want anything harmful to happen for that guy. He's a beacon of unity. I really hope that he will succeed, not only for the sake of Burkina Faso, but for the sake of the entire global P.A.C, the global Pan-African community, which is the entire Pan-African diaspora. So his success will be instrumental for African-American communities, Black people in the Caribbean and Latin America, and obviously for Africans, generally speaking. Unity, unity, unity. I'm going to end up here for today. So as it has become the norm, I will finish with a quote. A quote here that I am trying to locate very rapidly. And remember, the reason why I finished with this quote, as I had specified a while back, it's not just idolizing anybody, but it's really about encouragement, right? Giving us hope, ending on a positive note. I really, really believe that is important. So the quote I will end up with today is by none other than Frederick Douglass. I've showed this quote in the past, but the quote says, "I prayed for freedom for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs." I think that this is very apropos, also considering what Captain Ibrahim Traore is doing, his fight for freedom and so on. The key theme here is about action. Folks, brothers and sisters, we can wish for reform as long as we want. We can pray for it. We can talk about it. Without action, nothing will happen. Which is why I love this quote by Frederick Douglass. He only started getting answers when he started praying with his legs, meaning once he started going with action. You need action. We need action, Global PAC Nation, if we want to see true reform and we want to see true change. We need action. It's not about wishing, it's about organizing, coming together. This platform is about organizing. So if you like what we do, I really encourage you to please click on the subscribe button. It only takes a second. Be part of this growing community. As we organize, we can all organize together. We can grow together. We can grow with this platform, which is a growing platform, rapidly growing. I really thank you for all your support. Consider joining. I'll end up here for today. Remember, as I like to say, you are a beautiful people, and we are a beautiful people. We are a strong people. We are a very capable people. Don't let anybody convince you otherwise. Above all, we are the Global PAC. Until next time, peace be with you. Asante sana, which means thank you very much in Swahili. This was Tony Mfumu Simba Kwambamba Ngumbu. Until next time, thank you very much. We are the Global PAC.